Good afternoon. As we sit here today, people in Foggy Bottom and in Turtle Bay are busy drawing up plans for a Palestinian state for the day after the war. Israel's cabinet has categorically rejected the unilateral recognition of a Palestinian state. Said Prime Minister Netanyahu, quote, such an arrangement will grant a major prize, a prize that has never been seen before. We remain very grateful to the United States for vetoing yesterday in the Security Council an Algerian drafted resolution for a ceasefire, which would, in effect, reward Hamas for its October 7th atrocities. And this was for the third time. Yet, we have seen reports by Thomas Friedman in the New York Times and Barak Ravid in Axios that the United States is drawing up plans for a contiguous Palestinian state stretching through Judea and Samaria, or the West Bank, if you will, up until the Gazan coastline. This actually boggles the mind. After the most horrific attack on the Jewish people since the Holocaust, plans are being drawn up by the international community around the world to reward this barbarity with a ceasefire as well as with Palestinian statehood. One can well understand the feelings of the average Israeli citizen of mistrust for the Palestinians after these barbaric atrocities, as well as for the knowledge that the Palestinian Authority made textbooks are being used in all the UNRWA schools throughout not only Palestinian Authority-controlled territories, but Hamas-controlled territories and in Syria and Lebanon and Egypt in the UNRWA schools. What the world and the United States is calling for is a contiguous Palestinian state stretching from the high mountain plains of Judea and Samaria, overlooking the coastal plain of where most Israelis live, making Israel 9 miles wide in its narrowest waist, or leaving Israel with indefensible borders. Beyond that, according to the November 2023 poll by Khalil Shikaki of the Ramallah-based Palestinian Center for Survey and Policy Research, fully 82% of Palestinians living in the West Bank or Judea and Samaria, 82% support the atrocities of October 7th, and only 7% support Fatah or the PA. Yet the State Department is looking at resuscitating the PA. National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan has spoken about a, quote, revamped and revised Palestinian Authority. We have seen this show before in 1937, 1947, 1967, May 25th, 2000, 2008, and it never ends well. What guarantees do we have that the state will not become a proxy of Iran? How are we to be assured that even assuming the PA were to be, quote, revamped and revised, what guarantee do we have that that power will not change hands and that this entity would not become another jihadist state in the middle of Israel, making the very survival of Israel extremely difficult and giving it indefensible borders? Can the State Department, or the United Nations for that matter, do this without the consent of the Israeli government and the Israeli public? Here to discuss these questions and more is Dr. David Wormser. David Wormser is a tremendous, old, brilliant friend of myself and of Ahmet. He is the director of the Middle East Studies, and a senior scholar at the Center for Security Policy, as well as a fellow at the Muscab Institute for National Security and Zionist Strategy. David has served as Middle East advisor to former Vice President Dick Cheney and as special assistant and advisor to UN Ambassador John Bolton, who we'll be having on in a few weeks. He also served in the U.S. Naval Reserve as an intelligence officer at the rank of lieutenant commander. David is also the founder of the Delphi Global Analysis Group. Immediately following the 9/11 attacks, David consulted until January 2002 for the Office of the Secretary of Defense in the U.S. Department of Defense on a war-related classified project on understanding the nature and the strategic significance of terrorist group networks and their interactions with states. Before entering government, Dr. Wurmser founded the Middle East Studies program at the American Enterprise Institute, and in 1996, while at AEI, David published the book Tyranny's Ally, America's Failure to Defeat Saddam Hussein. David received his bachelor's degree and his MA as well as his PhD from Johns Hopkins. In addition to his book, he has been published in the Wall Street Journal, the Financial Times, and in Commentary magazine. My first question for you, David, is why does the State Department consistently return to its conventional thinking and its failed foreign policy paradigm about the two-state solution? Is there ever a capacity of policymakers to look back and reflect upon past mistakes?
Well, that's a really good question as to why they don't. Part of it is currently who the policy is personnel. And if you look at the personnel currently staffing the administration, this may be a problem deeper than the State Department. It may be the particular personnel that are staffing it, but which on one level have built their whole career and understanding of the Middle East through the Oslo peace process paradigm, which keeps failing, but they have no other way of understanding it. But in the case of many of them, like Samantha Power and Bob Malley, which still casts a strong shadow over the administration, Hedi Amar, Maher Bitar, these are ideologues. These are progressive ideologues who, and I don't use too strong a term here, they hate Israel. Maher Bitar, Hedi Amar, these were BDS types in college. Maher Bitar worked at UNRWA, the United Nations Relief Works Agency. This is the center of the controversy right now. Students for Justice in Palestine members, and so forth. And Samantha Powers goes back 20 years writing articles about how NATO should extend its protection to the Palestinians against Israel, NATO. So you're talking about, quite frankly, for no other word, it's the Obama administration Middle East core. And they are progressive, they're anti-Israeli, and they don't see a paradigm collapse. They see an opportunity to take Israel down a couple notches, even if they're for Israel's existence. And there is a question whether some of them are. But those that are, you had President Obama himself say in a telephone call to some of the, I think it was a council of major American Jewish organizations, that part of the problem is Israel feels too strong, and its sense of lack of vulnerability makes it more hardline and intransigent. That's the view they hold, and so you've got that. Then you've got the traditional State Department view, which over years has weakened, but the original idea was our interests are in the Arab world. There are many Arab countries. We have core interests in the Arab world. We have strategic interests that are anchored to our strategic position in the Middle East. And we can't reconcile Israel with the Arab world. And therefore, why, as much nice as we like the Jews, why should we destroy American interests for the sake of this tiny little semi-feasible country? That was the view in 1948. That was the view of a lot of the policy establishment. I think the historic record since then, and if one had been carefully examining it even then, would have led to the opposite result, which is the Arab world judges us through our relationship to Israel. They look at Israel as the forward position of the West. And if we're weak in defending Israel, they see us as a weak-willed superpower. And a weak-willed superpower is not a strong horse to whom you want to attach your cart. So ironically, the very idea that we need to reconcile our relations with the majority of the Arab world really leads us to draw closer to Israel, not further. But that, it's an understandable mistake, and reasonable people could disagree over that. But the State Department essentially took that view. I think it started weakening, but I think the infusion of these ideologues and the education, and then finally, I think you're seeing the final impact of our educational system. A lot of young people who are now 30, 35, 40 are filling the ranks of our government who have been educated in a very hostile academic environment to Israel. It was hostile a decade ago. Like now you're seeing it burst into overt anti-Semitism, but it was hostile. The Middle East Studies Association was hostile already for 20 years. So what you're seeing is, as the State Department traditional view fades, you're seeing the reinvigoration and probably more hatred of Israel emerge because of the rise of this ideological progressive sentiment as that certain staffers in this administration and the Obama administration had, as well as the youth who are being educated by these progressives and are beginning to fill the ranks of our government.
Right. You hit on many, many different concepts that they're all intersecting like Venn diagrams. But getting back to this view in the Middle East that Israel is just an outpost of Western democratic values, don't people in the State Department understand that as long as Israel is perceived that way, Russia, China, North Korea, and Iran are actually gaining from this sort of enmity and this further weakening of Israel by these sorts of plans?
Yeah, again, an excellent question, Sarah. It again goes back, one has to re-examine assumptions. The assumption that governs a lot of these people is what drives Arab hatred of the West, what drives Arab rage. And the common wisdom, which is wrong, but the common wisdom is rage is a function of grievance. They've been humiliated by us and they're reacting. So therefore, our entire policy, whether it's appeasing Iran, appeasing the Arabs over Israel, you go down, up and down the line, it's to address the grievance. This goes back to Herbert Samuel. Herbert Samuel and the British Empire, as well as the French, tried to address the grievances of the most radical elements of Arab society, whether it was the National Front in Syria or Hajj Amin al-Husseini or Saad Zaghloul in Egypt. And what they did is they validated the grievance. They validated the extremism by raising them up as the choice of the power, rather than discredit them by trying to address their grievance. So Bernard Lewis always used to say the grievance in the Middle East emerges from disdain and contempt, not from grievance. It emerges from the very fundamental idea that how is it that the Muslim world, which was the future, which had defeated Europe in the the 700s to 1400s, the continent of, as they put it, people who had no sun, who wore leather and fur, cold people, barbarians, according to the Arabs. How did they win? Did they start a 1,000-year process of reversing the Arab expansion, the Muslim expansion? And so they're looking in terms of validation that is an anomaly. Even though it's 1,000 years, it's an anomaly. And so their hatred is driven and fueled by contempt. And any sign of weakness or failure in the West is seized as an inciting, as a invigorating principle. So if you look at it those two ways, rage is contempt or rage is grievance. Grievance will lead you to a policy of constantly appeasing the West. And rage being driven by contempt means that you have to show self-respect, respect, and strength. So the policy of grievance actually destroys you if you're wrong, and rage is driven by contempt. And I think the historical record, again, if you look back, every time we show ourselves as self-excoriating, it winds up in a complete meltdown. And allies begin to run for cover, and they feel scared because in the Middle East, it's essentially still the culture originates in Arab culture, which is ultimately the peninsular structure of tribalism and so forth. And tribes don't get very far if they don't find allies that are strong and stick with their interests.
Right.
It's a very clear-headed point of view. So
That's
if
right.
the United States loses its way, if Israel acts weak and concedes, it's not worth anything to them. And if it's not worth anything, then they're willing to, they're willing to, it's a freebie then. You can dump on them for your own purposes, and you don't have to worry about it because they're not going to be your ally because they're not useful as an ally.
Right, right. Which will only come back to bite us here. But
Correct.
you also hit upon what's been going on for decades and decades, stretching back to Edward Said at Columbia and Hatem Bazian at Berkeley in academia. And we know the 18 to 24-year-olds are not in favor of Israel because of these decades of brainwashing. Do you could you hit upon the concept of intersectionality? And I mean, it is such a simple, facile concept, but somehow it seems to have dominated the thinking of many, many young people.
Intersectionality, DEI, it all boils down to one central point, which is there are oppressors and there are oppressed. The oppressors, every behavior of the oppressed is legitimate because it is fighting evil. The oppressors are evil. And even though they may behave in a way that on the surface appears to be enlightened and free and democratic, it's a fraud. So the 1619 Project, which argues that slavery is the American system, it wasn't a flaw, a blemish on the American system. That was a march toward freedom that was imperfect at the beginning, but moves forward and corrects its mistakes. And the Civil War was a big one, with a lot of blood spilled to correct it. The 1619 Project's view is no, the very purpose of America was never freedom, was never the 800 years of Anglo-Saxon history before that, from the Magna Carta through the Petition of Right and Bill of Rights and so forth of the British. It was nothing more than a structure defined around the perpetuation of slavery. Slavery was the soul of what America was. And the Civil War didn't change it. It just changed the form of slavery. So the oppression continues. The oppression continues unabated. It hasn't been improved at all. It's just dressed better and dressed more slickly. So that's the essence of intersectionality. And then you divide the world up that way. There are the European colonialists, the evil white people. And then the battle over Israel becomes, are you white or are you not white? And frankly, there's a lot of Jews out there who are trying to say, no, don't lump us together in the category of whites. We're Yemenites, and my wife's Yemenite, et cetera, et cetera. Look at the Ethiopian Jews who are in Israel, et cetera, et cetera. It's a no-win situation because it isn't really anything objectively about genes or skin color. It is about whether you're in the politically correct category or the politically incorrect category. And the politically incorrect category then is rammed into the idea of the oppressor. So you can't escape it. You can be Judge Thomas and you're white. Justice Thomas and be white. You could be an Ethiopian Jew and you're white. And you can be Tamimi, what is her name? The Tamimi girl from the Palestinians who's blonde-haired and blue-eyed, and she's colored. So it really, in the end, it's a way of dividing up the world between good and evil. And good has the right to employ any means to defeat evil. So even rape, beheading of children who are 1 year old, stuffing live children in ovens, all these things we saw on October 7th. This is all justified because of the mass oppression and destruction and grievance that drives the oppressed to be extreme because they have no choice. So that's really the view. And that's really the informing structure that defines our youth, unfortunately.
So, as Israel is stretching towards day 140 of the war between Israel and Hamas, we're seeing Tehran's many proxies and vassal states becoming engaged in the war. David, you just wrote a brilliant piece for the journal American Greatness, saying that the US, French, and British officials are trying to work out a formula to contain the war from the north with the Iranian-backed proxy Hezbollah. You wrote that Israelis understand that Hezbollah and its ridwan force make what happened in Gaza a smaller version of what Hezbollah can possibly do. Yet Israelis feel escalation with Hezbollah is inevitable. Why is this?
Okay, yeah. First of all, I think the fundamental paradigms that existed on October 6th in the United States, which were the same as the delusional ones in Israel, did not collapse on October 7th. The opposite, they became stronger. America's full tilt going for Oslo 2.0 rather than questioning the wisdom of it. But the other side is Iran. And the idea that the Iranian regime is here to stay, there's something authentic about the Iranian regime. The Iranian people may dislike the regime at times, but the regime is an expression of Iranianness. And that therefore, it is a reality with which we have to deal. It's a very powerful reality with lots of allies around the region. So the paradigm is that you have to come to a strategic understanding with Iran. And only through a strategic understanding with Iran can you get it to rein in its proxies and bring regional stability. That didn't collapse for the United States policymakers on October 7th. It did for Israel. There is no coming to terms. There is no stability. Iran is in a strategic twilight struggle to the death with the West, with Israel, with Saudi Arabia. It's a all or nothing conflict for Iran. So everything has to be poured through a strategic lens. But for the United States, it has to be poured through a lens of accommodation and conflict management. And that means that escalation is the worst thing you can have. Hamas was okay because we wanted Oslo 2.0 and we wanted to make Palestine safe for Abu Mazen. So the destruction of Hamas, at least at the beginning, was something that appeared to Israel and America as a convergence of interest, when in fact it was really a common path for two very different results. But nevertheless, for the first few weeks and months, it seemed to be a convergence. The North, it seemed to be also the Israelis did not want a two-front war. It is a very dangerous situation to be in a two-front war full tilt. It was quite fortunate that Hamas attacked and Hezbollah did not that first day. It's really unthinkable the damage and destruction and pain Israel would have suffered had Hezbollah also attacked that day in full force. So I can see the Israelis wanting to kick the can down the road on Lebanon until they're ready to deal with that front. Kick the can, not years, I'm talking about weeks and months at most. Because it's an unlivable circumstance. The security concept of being defensive, allowing your enemy to build up and sit on your border and being confident that you have the ability to parry their thrust and then take the war to them easily was shattered on October 7th. So people won't go back to live in those border areas. Israel loses a third of its country if it doesn't address the security threat from it. So it's inevitable Israel will either go to war or have an agreement that pushes Hezbollah back. In my view, it has to be beyond the Awali River, not the Litani River. But nevertheless, that's the State Department, though, their objective is de-escalation. Nothing else matters. De-escalation because the paradigm is coming to terms with Iran. Now, why don't I think it'll happen? I think if the parameters were where the Israelis are, and I have some reservations about this, but that they need to return the communities to the border. The border will not, the communities will not return if they are within range of anti-tank missiles. And the anti-tank missiles now are clear to have a range of 8 to 10 kilometers. So the first 8 to 10 kilometers of Israel become unlivable. So if you can push Hezbollah back 8 to 10 kilometers, you could effectively create a buffer zone that then protects the communities. As far as the precision guided munitions and the 100,000+ missiles, well, that the buffer zone doesn't help anyway. So essentially, I think the Israeli position, and I think, again, it's a mistake, it's tactical. Even the Israelis are thinking in October 6 terms that if you just create a wider wall, you'll be safe behind that wider wall. If it's not a higher wall, it's a wider wall. I think what they're missing is that it still leaves the problem in place. Hezbollah probably won't agree because the Radwan forces, their families, they come from those communities. So they can't leave their communities behind. The Radwan force can't withdraw to Litani and their family lives south of Litani. But I think there's a bigger thing, which is the missed opportunity that Israel has, which is, I don't think we appreciate that the Shiite community in southern Lebanon is a dagger also in Iran's heart. Iran needs positive control of South Lebanon Shiites because they're traditional Shiites. They don't really agree with the Iranian revolutionary ideology. And Hezbollah is there as much to impose ideological rigidity on the Shiites of southern Lebanon. So no Shiite community in the world of significant stature can pose an ideological threat or a font of ideological threats to the Iranian regime's minority revolutionary ideology. That's the real purpose of Hezbollah, is to subjugate Amal and subjugate the Shiite Awakening that predates Iran's revolution in 1979. It's the same reason why the very first thing that happened after the United States went into Iraq was the assassination of major Shiite religious figures by Iran. Al-Hakim, Ayatollah al-Hakim, all by Iran, because they could not tolerate an independent Shiite effervescence anywhere, not in southern Iraq, which was Shiite, and not in Lebanon. So for me, and those Shiites live south of the Awali River in Lebanon. So I think Israel is missing a strategic opportunity by forcing the imposition of UN Security Council Resolution 1701, which removes Hezbollah north of the Litani, not just of the Litani, but north of the Litani, into basically the Awali River. And
Right.
Iran, Iran can't tolerate that.
So you're talking now about some really important history that most people aren't aware of. Can you talk about the break between the Lebanese Shiite cleric Ayatollah Massa Sadr and the Iranian Ayatollah Rahmani, and why this is still important today?
All right. Well, the PLO came into Lebanon from Jordan and basically destroyed the country and took the country over. And they were cover also for Sunni Arab nationalism, which was really took out their anger. They couldn't really take their anger out on Israel, except for Katyushas, but Israel kept basically responding. So the real suppression, the real oppression in Lebanon was of the Shiites. So the Shiites began to, and some young Shiites began to leave the faith and were attracted to the Soviet Union and communism, and they drifted toward the PLO, even though they were Shiites, and it was primarily anti-Shiite sentiment beyond the PLO. One young one was Ahmad Mughniya, who became one of Arafat's closest associates in Force 17. So a cleric arose, Musa al-Sadr, he came from Iraq, came to and Iran, and he came to southern Lebanon, and he created what's called the Shiite Awakening, and he created what now we know as Amal. And it was organizing the Shiites into a militia primarily against the PLO, against the Palestinians. and to try to resurrect for the first time in 1,000 years some degree of Shiite self-protection. They were a minority that never protected themselves except in Iran. So he reinvigorated. And now comes the Iranian Revolution, and they have a real problem. They want to say, we are the Shiite Awakening. And we have a revolutionary idea that these other clerics don't agree with. So the Shiite Awakening in Lebanon was not something they liked. They had to take control of it and distort it in their direction. And to do that, they had to kill Musa al-Sadr. And that's why the Iranian Revolution and the PLO did, by the way, kill Musa al-Sadr with the Libyans. And the Iranian Revolution, the closest relations it had at the beginning of its revolution were with the PLO and with Libya, who had killed Musa al-Sadr, the founder of the Shiite Awakening in Amal. And that tells you exactly what Iran was after. It was control of the Shiites of Lebanon. Because the Shiites of Lebanon, poor as they were, backwater of Lebanon as they were historically one of the key centers of Shiite learning and respect and communities across the region. So it was a very dangerous thing for Iran to allow an independent Shiite presence in Lebanon. And you see it even as recently as a decade or a decade and a half ago, is the Iranians were having a great deal of trouble with the clerics of southern Lebanon that were Shiite. And they really need Hezbollah to crush any independent thinking. And that's why they can't leave southern Lebanon. But UN Resolution 1701, which ended the 2006 Israeli-Lebanese war, it demands of the Hezbollah to withdraw to north, to basically to the Litani River, which would leave those Shiite populations not under Hezbollah control. So not only do I think the Israelis are making a mistake by not sticking to the UN Resolution 1701 and instead giving a prize to Hezbollah by drawing the line further south, because basically the 15 years of Hezbollah rejecting 1701 and attacking and building up and infiltrating the south and blowing away UNIFIL all now pays off. Hezbollah can stay much further south than they were allowed to under 1701. So not only does it give Iran a prize and Hezbollah a prize for violating the UN resolution, but I think it removes from Israel a great strategic opportunity that has reverberations ideologically to weaken the Iranian regime in Iran. And that is, if this is a strategic conflict, and it is a strategic conflict, that should be the first thing on Israel's mind. What weakens Iran? Not just its proxies, Iran. And that means that they should take a much tougher line in these discussions on Lebanon. And there's no way in the end Hezbollah can agree to that. So unfortunately,
the
war,
Right. Okay. So we spoke about UN Security Council Resolution 1701, which talks about retreating 30 kilometers north of the Litani River. Now the international community is only talking about 10 kilometers. First of all, what has UNIFIL done or not done? What has the Lebanese armed forces done or not done? And why is agreeing to this really a horrific idea?
Well, it's again the same concept as, I mean, you saw it in Oslo, you saw it in the maritime agreement with Lebanon, and you see it now. The idea is that you can create an indigenous local force that is not under the control of Hezbollah or the PLO or Hamas to do your bidding for you, and you don't need to actually pay a price. The Lebanese armed forces is part of the Lebanese government, which is controlled by Hezbollah. Whether they wear a Lebanese flag or a Hezbollah flag doesn't really matter. You can build up the Lebanese armed forces. It is a fiction in Washington that you're building it up as a bulwark against Hezbollah, every bit more that you're building up the Palestinian Authority forces or the PLO or Abu Mazen against Hamas or against extremism. It's all the same thing. The idea that you can somehow bring economic development, and the part of the ceasefire is, oh, we will pour money into southern Lebanon to develop it, as if, first of all, economic development was the issue. But second of all, more importantly, the idea, again, was behind the Lebanon Maritime Agreement was if you give Lebanon an independent economic foundation, it will tell bye-bye to the Iranians. They don't need the Iranians and they can go home. And Hezbollah will then choose to be a Lebanese faction and then reasonable. This is sort of like saying to the Czechs in the Cold War, we're going to pour lots of money into the Czech army, in the Warsaw Pact Czech army. We're going to arm it with the latest weaponry and so forth, because then they can say no to the Russians, to the Soviet Union. It was delusional. It was never thought of even back then. It's delusional. It does not do anything. UNIFIL, we've got another problem, which is, apart from the fact that it was completely useless, it couldn't even monitor properly the movements of Hezbollah. But let's take a look at UNRWA and the UN's role overall now. These international organizations, we have to do a good, long, hard think about how complicitous international organizations are in the genocidal war against the Jewish people. UNRWA was teaching children to kill Jews and to annihilate Israel. UN systems have been complicitous in the effort to destroy Israel and destroy the Jewish people. I would go as far as to say the Red Cross has a studied history of this. There's things that are not public, but believe me, even in World War II, there were very horrible things that Count Bernadotte, who seemed to be a friend of the Jews, there are documents that are out there that show he was no friend of the Jews. He was actually an agent of the SS, and the use of the Red Cross by the SS to whitewash things like Theresienstadt, and then afterwards the British knew this, and they could use Bernadotte, who had this aura of being a friend of the Jews, to try to present a plan in 1947-48 that effectively destroyed any prospect for an Israeli state to arise. And they used a blackmail against Bernadotte to make it, but yet used. Anyway, a proper study of the Red Cross even would show a long history of complicity in the attack on the Jewish people. And I think we really need to think seriously about these international organizations from a Western and from an American point of view, and a moral point of view. But practically, in terms of Israel, these organizations have again and again proven themselves to be worse than useless. They've been complicitous in the attack on Israel. So they can't do it. And if the United States wants to put 100,000 troops in southern Lebanon, fine. But it's at this point, it looks more like the United States, in an attempt to come to terms with Iran, is going to pull out its troops from Iraq. So America's showing itself to be the perfidious Albion that Britain was reputed to have been 100 years ago. And nobody in the region will take that seriously, and nobody can bank their security interests on it. So in the end, I think Israel has to assert over southern Lebanon an umbrella of security, whether it's its own army or whether it's a South Lebanese army again, or some resurrection of it. It's an awful thing to think of, but I think in the end, it has to be cleaned out by the IDF, and then some structure set up that ultimately allows Israel to intervene and re-enter when necessary, and generally actually does what it's supposed to do, rather than what until now has been useless.
Right. And people talk about UN Security Council Resolution 1701, but they forget the real operative resolution is 1559.
Correct. Correct.
Which Israel obeyed, totally, when they pulled out of South Lebanon in 2000. But unfortunately, the Hezbollah is still there. It is still being kept under foreign control by Iranian-backed Hezbollah. So we have to talk also
but by the way, Sarah, you're right. 1701 also doesn't just call for, it refers to 1559 and other resolutions. It doesn't just call for Hezbollah to withdraw to 30 kilometers in the Wali River, that's only stage one. Stage two is it has to disband. It is an illegitimate militia that has to be disbanded. It is not a legitimate organization in any shape or form by UN resolution.
All right. And we see also what's going on in the south with the Iranian-backed Yemenis militia, the Houthis. They sunk a British vessel in the Red Sea on February 19th, and they've severely damaged a Greek flagship. And this morning, they claim to have attacked the Israeli flagship, the MSC Silver, in the Gulf of Aden. What is going on? Where is the control? Where are the big guys? You know, we had two aircraft carriers in the Mediterranean, one's retreated. Where's the United States in all of this?
Well, again, I think it's our foreign policy is now hostage to our attempt to appease Iran and the whole concept of the paradigm with Iran. It's horrifying because British foreign policy has been for 400 years, ever since the Spanish Armada's defeat, is mastery of the seas. Now, for them, it was not only free trade, it was also to access continents for imperial control. But for the United States, since day one of our republic, and in fact, the creation of the Marines and the creation of our Navy, and it's why our Constitution talks about, it's in the Constitution that we shall maintain a Navy and raise an army. In other words, when war threatens, we'll raise our armed forces, we have militias, we'll mobilize. But a Navy we must maintain at all times. And the reason for it is America is a continent, but it's also conceptually an island. So for us, freedom of navigation, freedom of the seas has been a foundation. It has been the most important anchor of our foreign policy, beyond our borders, our offshore policy, beyond water's edge policy of the United States since the Constitution. Since the Constitution of the United States. We built the Blue Water Navy for this. We built the Marines for this. And this now is being surrendered. For the first time in 220 years, the very foundation of American defense concept is being surrendered for an ideological pursuit of appeasement of Iran. We're not willing to do what we need to do to keep this strategic waterway open because we're afraid of a fight with Iran.
Awful. And now I'm going to, for a few minutes, turn the microphone over to our wonderful new Director of Operations, Sarah Grace Victor, who will read some of the questions that have come in. Sarah Grace? Sarah Grace,
Hi.
are you there?
Hi. How are you?
Oh, great.
How are you? Thank you so much for sharing and for your questions, Sarah. I was wondering, could you share a little bit more, how do we, from the perspective of the general population in the US, right? We're facing a lot of questions from our surrounding neighbors about how do we speak about Israel? How do we confront when people are pushing back against us? We have some questions about university context, for example, students who are facing opposition, Jewish students who are being assaulted. How do you encourage people to speak from a place of respect and knowledge? How do we kind of turn on that switch to be helpful, but also push back in regards to the dialogue?
Sure. There's really two different camps that we have to worry about, especially among the youth. One is the progressive camp, and one is actually this rising camp on the right. We have to be honest. There's a rising camp on the right too, that's a problem, and they have to be dealt with differently. The camp on the left, the progressives, their basic view is this overall intersectionality, the idea of oppression. And I think the most important thing is not to try to say we're white or not white or whatever. The most important thing is to go back and make sure history is becoming relevant again. One of the things that happened in our universities is the utter distortion of history based on the ignorance of history. You can't get around the fact that as much as there's 1,000 books writing the history of the Middle East that write out the Jewish people as nothing more than a European colonialist presence, those are all books written in the last 20, 30, 40 years. They can't come up with contemporaneous sources to show that there was a Palestinian nation in 1850 or 1930. So I think a very strong, important effort, funding by Jewish community, funding by evangelical communities, funding by those who care in the West about Western civilization, re-establishing a proper study of history and the role of the Jewish people in that history. Because once you do that, the whole case for the Palestinianism falls apart.
Yeah.
The second thing is to drive home the point to the left. And this is why I have a problem with the Palestinian state. It isn't just the question of now with October 7th that you give a prize and validate and make a celebration out of October 7th by giving them the prize of nationhood. Because if it's coupled, you have now taken October 7th, the day of evil, and made it a day of liberation, if it led to the creation of a Palestinian state. So that's bad, but worse than that, I think we have to come to terms with the fact that the idea of a Palestinian nation is the negation of the Jewish nation. It isn't just a desire for self-determination in some corner of the Middle East for a people who are dispossessed. It is and has been since its beginning the idea of it a negation of the Jewish people. And that is why it can't give up the idea that the Jews are not indigenous. That's why it's so natural to align it with the intersectionality crowd, et cetera, et cetera. One has to, and Israel itself made a huge mistake in Oslo by recognizing Palestinians as a people. One needs to deal with this as a population issue. How do you deal with a population that doesn't want to live under Israeli control? And then there are practical answers to that, many of them, not one path. So it's important, I think, that we have to stop talking about, oh, yes, the Palestinians are a legitimate nation and we just have to split the difference. Because the moment you consider them legitimate, the negation of Jewish claims to the territory kick in, and then you're never going to get anywhere. So you have to teach history. You have to make it clear we are the indigenous people. The Jewish people are the indigenous people to the area. And Palestinian nationhood is a fiction. There are Arabs who live there. There are Palestinian Arabs who live there. They have to be dealt with practically as a governance question and a freedom question, but not through the context of a Palestinian state. It has to be something else, Emirates or something like that. That's the left. You have to basically rebuild the history and lay down the facts about Jewish indigenousness. And on the right, I think the worry there is it's an anti-Semitic idea, but the Jews are trying to trick us to fight their wars for them and entangle us in the Middle East. And it's not really in our interest to be entangled in the Middle East, but it's because of Israel that we have to be entangled. And the Iranians play this up, by the way. They play it up with a number of commentators in the United States and so forth. So you American servicemen are dying because of the Zionists. I think the main point that has to be made is Israel is not asking America to fight its war. It's actually fighting the West's war for it. It's asking to be just left to leave them alone to fight their war. Don't interfere to trip them up and sabotage them. Just let them win. Israel doesn't need us. It doesn't need our forces. It needs us just to be there to help them stopgap measure to some ammunition. But at the moment, Israel doesn't need our forces. It just needs our support. So the answer to the right is precisely to avoid having America have a presence in the region. It should subcontract to its strongest ally the establishment of a powerful victory for Israel right now, around which then other regional players like the Saudis, the UAE, will hook their cart. Israel emerges as the strong horse. Then peace will break out in a very strategic way between Israel and a number of other countries. And that is a far stronger foundation for American presence in the region without a very big American troop presence in the region. So it should be in the interests of the right, which does not want to spend a lot of effort securing the Middle East, whether they want it in Asia or they want to pull to isolationism. A strong Israel is the foundation for preserving our interests in the region. So we should be the first to wish Israel a great victory and not try to sabotage it. That should be the argument to the right.
That makes sense. I think the U.S. has dealt with a lot of, we talked about the Houthis, about not just the U.S., but other countries are dealing with the terrorism in the region and the death of a few U.S. service members as well recently. So I think we definitely have an interest in containing terrorism, and Israel is at the forefront of that in the Middle East. So I think your point is well taken. And so you alluded to this a little bit, but I'm curious to hear your thoughts on how do we establish these governance structures, right? In the day after the war, what would that look like? How do we create this sense of just governance post the active live war in Gaza?
Right. Well, the big damage of Oslo and the Palestinian Authority is by creating the idea of the Palestinian State nation, you bring the question back to 1948. Whose land is it? And you reopen the question of whether Israel was a legitimate creation. Was it a colonial implant? So the very bringing in of the PLO, which was created in 1964, before Israel even took the West Bank, Gaza, or Judea, Samaria, and Gaza, is the 48 question. Same with the refugees, all the refugees around the Middle East, in Lebanon, Syria, Jordan. These are the 48 questions. By bringing in the PLO and by raising the issue of Palestinian nationhood, you inherently raise the issue of 1948. The other question is the question of 67, which is Israel took these territories. There's too many Arabs there for Israel to absorb and still maintain fully its Jewish character. That was the idea. So let's find a practical way where Israel can allow them to govern themselves, whether it's Begin's autonomy plan or so forth. So they have freedom and they live their lives and they never see Israeli soldiers. They have self-governance. But security-wise and sovereignty-wise, the territory is not under their control. It's under Israel's control. That was the idea at the beginning. After 67 in some way, whether it's village leagues or so forth. Then arose the PLO being brought back into the territories and the Palestinian State and then sovereignty. And that's where it went off the rails. I think you have to go back then and have some concept of an entity that is self-governing, that is not sovereign as a state. Because the moment you have a state, what is the definition of a state? Are you allowed to have your military? Well, if you're a sovereign state, yes. Israel can't allow them to have a military that threatens her. Are you allowed to have independent foreign relations? A sovereign state, yes. But then that entity could go sign a treaty with Iran. Can you have a large army? Well, obviously, if you're a state. Are you allowed to, is Israel allowed to enter at will to arrest terrorists who are about to conduct a major terrorist attack on Israel? Obviously not if it's an independent state. So the real question is why independent state if then you remove all those things? At that point, you get to autonomy. And then you get to the self-governance question. Do you want the Israeli army to decide where the sewer is in Gaza City or in Khan Yunis? Probably not. The army has many better things to do. So you want to find local forces. And this also goes to a very deep and historical philosophical question of what is Arab society in that area. It's more tribal, it's more clan, it has ancient roots. The Palestinian Authority, the PLO, Hamas, these are revolutionary organizations that Hajj Amin al-Husseini the Palestinian Arab leader of the 1920s and 30s that aligned with the Nazis. This was a German intelligence attempt in the 20s and 30s, and then a Nazi attempt in the 30s and 40s, and then a Soviet attempt in the 40s onward to undermine traditional society among the Arabs that was more and more aligning with the British, with the West, and so forth. These traditional structures Israel can work with. But all these external forces are revolutionary and are anchored to the idea of Palestinianism. So you have to defeat the idea of Palestinianism, and you have to return these structures to local governance structures that are anchored to traditional families, traditional clans that work directly with the IDF and with the Israeli government to manage the daily affairs of the lives of the people that live in the areas, with the Israelis present as an overall umbrella security-wise and there. But this cannot happen until Israel takes the entirety of Gaza and expunges it of the remnants of Hamas. And this will take time. We forget, after 67, Israel had the Mirdaf, the chase. It was a period of 3 years, which Israel was in pitched battles with the PLO in Judea and Samaria, with lots of terrorism and so forth. It took Israel 3 years to purge the Judea and Samaria from the PLO. So we're in another mirdaf, another chase, another period like that. And in that period, the IDF has to be present all the time in all the territory. So a transitional period of IDF control. And then I think eventually Mordechai Kedar has this emirate plan, which I think it divides it up. There's no Palestinian state. There are 5 emirates in Gaza. There's no Palestinianism. Semi-independent Israeli control. I would see those as the proper long-term solutions to this.
That makes
Thank
sense.
you so much, David. Oh, I'm sorry, Sarah. Did you want to say something?
No, I wanted to agree. I liked what you said, David, about not rewarding Palestinian statehood at this time when it's so intrinsically tied to the idea of destroying Israel. And I think that's an important point to keep in mind. So I wanted to just affirm that. So back to you, Sarah.
Thank you so much, Sarah Grace. It is going to take a tremendous amount of work, and unfortunately, more than just a bit of bloodshed, to be able to dislodge the kind of conventional thinking that we see in the State Department and decades upon decades of brainwashing of Palestinian students. Certainly since September 13th, 1993, Oslo, and actually really going back far further than that. But and there have been a tremendous number of excellent questions that have come in, some of which I might send you. And David, maybe at a future time, I think it would be wonderful to be able to have just another webinar devoted to these international organizations of jurisdiction, such as the International Red Cross and Camp Bernadette, and things that the history that even continues today, when you see that medicines that were supposed to be given to the hostages have wound up in Gazan hospitals and Hamas hospitals. So, there is a lot of food for thought here. David, you were such a treat to talk to. Please know that you can go to the Center for Securitypolicy.org to donate to the center. There's a red donate button there. We want to always support our wonderful friends such as David Wormser and Frank Gaffney Jr. at the Center for Security Policy. Also know that we are on Capitol Hill every day. Joseph is going to be on the Hill this afternoon as we speak, and we really do need your support to be able to get these very, very important ideas to our policymakers. So please also, we really do very much depend on the support of our viewers. So please go to emitonline.org as well, and please donate to us. We are dependent upon you for our further existence. So thank you so much, and David, to be continued. Thanks again.
Thank you.